Good evening, everyone. Hello, welcome to Trouble Begins. So we're letting people filter in. So welcome to the Mark Twain House's Trouble Begins with Donna Harrington-Lueker on her book, Books for Idle Hours, 19th Century Publishing and the Rise of Summer Reading. My name is Mallory Howard. I'm the assistant curator at the Mark Twain House and Museum, and we are so excited to have you this evening for this virtual event. As a reminder, a replay of the event will be made available on the Trouble Begins playlist of our YouTube channel, accessible through our website, so you can always rewatch it again. At the end of the program, we will take a few minutes to answer some questions from the audience. So as we go through the program, if a question springs to mind, please make sure you ask it in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Before we get started tonight, I'd like to thank our sponsors for the 2023 Trouble Begins series. First, the Center for Mark Twain Studies in Elmira, New York, and also Connecticut Humanities, a nonprofit affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which supports cultural and historic organizations that tells the state's stories, builds community, and helps to enrich lives. So thank you to them, of course. So now let me introduce our guest. Donna is a professor of English, Communications, and Media at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island, where her research interests include book history, the alternative and underground press, and women and gender studies. Her work has appeared in 19th Century Studies, Journalism, History, and the Keats-Shelley Journal, and her book on 19th century summer reading has been cited in the New Yorker, Yankee, the New England Quarterly, the Washington Post, CSPAN, and other media outlets. And of course, she was integral in helping us. We used her book quite often when researching our exhibit for business or pleasure, which if you haven't visited the museum to see it yet, please make sure to go and do so. We have a fantastic summer reading section, which, as I said, we really relied on Donna and her wonderful book and research to make happen. So without further ado, I will welcome Donna to the screen, and I will be back later for a Q&A. So please enjoy.
Mallory, thank you so much. Thank all of you for coming. And thank you, Jody and Mallory, for making this possible and doing all the troubleshooting that we've been doing. And finally, a thank you to the Mark Twain House for inviting me. I am a bookish sort, and the Twain House has always been one of my favorite author houses. Let me cue up my PowerPoint here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. It doesn't get any easier even after 3 years, but let's give this a try. Okay, I'm thinking it's okay, and somebody will tell me otherwise.
It's great, Donna.
Okay, great, thank you. A talk about the rise of summer reading really could begin anywhere in the 19th century. But I'd like to start tonight's talk in Boston and then move on to Elmira, New York, for two 19th century scenes of summer reading that I think can kind of situate us in this conversation. First, let's go to Boston, or really Dorchester, with Alice Stone Blackwell. Alice is the daughter of Lucy Stone and Henry Brown Blackwell, the prominent 19th century abolitionists and women's rights advocates. You can see here on the left-hand side of the screen a family portrait. That's Alice looking a little bit dour in the middle there. On the right is their Pope's Hill home in Dorchester, and that's going to factor into the story in just a bit. In the early 1870s, Alice was a teenager, and she was an absolutely voracious reader, especially in the summertime, when her reading turned quite markedly to stories of adventure and sensation. If you look at her summer journals, the entries are filled with accounts of her rushing into Boston by train or streetcar to pick up the latest issue of Robert Bonner's weekly, The Ledger, the popular story paper, or she'd stop at the Boston Public Library or the Boston Athenaeum, and she'd come out with stacks and stacks of books that she would read and return the next week. But Alice took part in a far different kind of summer reading as well. Throughout the summer, the Stone Blackwell household engaged in shared family reading. This would have been a very common 19th century reading practice. But in the summer, they did so on the widow's walk, high atop the family's Dorchester home, in order to take advantage of the cool breezes from the nearby bay. There, Alice reports, the family read books like Sir Walter Scott's The Antiquary and Thackeray's Vanity Fair, novels whose plots, as you could tell, they'd spool out over the course of many a summer evening. And her delight in these reading sessions is absolutely apparent in her journals. I have a quote here from her, quote, "The Antiquary was read upon the roof," she wrote in July 1872, "and I chased Papa about to tickle his toes." Okay, so second, let's move west just a little bit to the Twain family's quarry farm in Elmira, New York, where the family spent a number of summers. We can see some images of those here. For Twain, summers were largely working summers. In the summer of 1883, for example, he reports plowing through the manuscript, returning to the manuscript of Huckleberry Finn in Elmira, and really plowing through the manuscript pages. In 1905, at a summer house in Dublin, New Hampshire, he'd reflect, and here's a quote, "The summer has been my working time for 35 years. And his letters bear that out. And this was really very, very typical for authors of the period, that the summer vacation was just a chance to change place, but to keep up with the work that was involved in being a professional author. Summer is a working time, and indeed, his letters rarely mention leisure reading in the summer, except perhaps for one really scathing review of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which he just pronounced boring. There is Twain over on the left in his study, and over on the right, it's not the same story for the women in Twain's life, the women in his family. That's another story entirely. As the current exhibit at the Twain House documents, Susie Clemens, for example, wrote to her grandmother from the Catskills in 1887, telling her about reading and enjoying Eliot's Daniel Deronda. So Eliot was a little bit more palatable to other members of the Twain family. And Twain's letters suggest, too, that the summer was that time for his bookish summer guests to enjoy themselves. In July 1887, Twain wrote of a superb, that was the word he used, superb Sunday afternoon at Quarry Farm, reporting that the Cranes were, quote, reading and loafing in the canvas-curtained summer house 50 yards away. He went on to write that his wife was at the farmhouse, but he was going to go back and bring her up to the Cranes to, quote, help us occupy the lounges and the hammocks. It was a perfect day indeed, and lounges and hammocks were the perfect reading piece of furniture. Hammocks, classic novels, thrillers, adventures, yes, even George Eliot. Such summer reading practices still resonate with us today. Every year, sometime around the Memorial Day weekend, we're all familiar with this, I'm sure, the summer reading season begins. Oprah makes her picks for the best summer reads, but so does the New York Times. So does National Public Radio, the Boston Globe, the Washington Globe, and a host of other media outlets. These are some of the images that I captured from summer 2023. On the right from Connecticut Public Radio, what to read this summer. On the left at the top, the Today Show, television shows have increasingly become part of the summer reading curation. And then the illustration at the bottom from the venerable New York Times book section, about 125 years old, I think, this year. We're all familiar with this phenomenon. Summer's the time when we're advised to turn to lightweight paperbacks that we can stuff into a beach bag or that we can read without worry when we're by the poolside. We're told to reach for the light popular novel, the action-packed bestseller. But what we're not so familiar with, I think, is this. When we eagerly await for these lists of summer reads, when we reach for that lightweight paperback, you know, the one with the umbrella on the cover and maybe a little bit of surf on the side, we're taking part in a publishing trend that started in the mid-19th century and that persists today. Indeed, if you name any of today's summer reading practices, indulging in escapist beach blanket reading, leaving a paperback pot boiler behind so that the next person at the hotel or cottage can read it instead, vowing to tackle that weighty literary classic that's been on your shelf for at least 3 years. Name any of these practices, and you can find them taking shape in the 19th century, when Americans flocked to railroad cars and steamboat lines to engage in the newfound practice of summer leisure. And when they arrived, they found a selection of light reading waiting for them at the train depot, at the dockside, and in the souvenir stores. Some of the most famous authors of the period wrote for this summer market. And I have 4 of them here. On the left, of course, Louisa May Alcott. Next to her, Stephen Crane, the author of The Red Badge of Courage. To the right of Crane, William Bean Howells, the Dean of American Letters, one of the most prolific novelists of the 19th century. And then Sarah Ann Jewett, the great Maine writer, over on the right. Now, I call your attention to these because each of them had a connection with the summer market. Louisa May Alcott, before she was the Miss Alcott, the author of Little Women, Louisa May Alcott wrote what were called blood and thunder tales, sensational stories. She wrote them for the popular story papers of the time, and she set several of these at summer resorts. Her very, very first story, the blood and thunder tale that gets published, is called Pauline's Passion and Punishment. It appeared in Frank Leslie's popular weekly story paper. It began at a Saratoga-like resort and then moved on to what appears to be the White Mountains, more specifically, a precipice in the White Mountains. More specifically, spoiler alert, someone goes over the precipice on the White Mountains to bring an end to the tale. You can get the flavor of these blood and thunder tales. Stephen Crane tried to follow on the phenomenal best-selling The Red Badge of Courage with a much less noticed novel called The Third Violet, set at a summer resort. Howells, 14 novels either set at summer resorts, or he would also use summer resorts to move his people around, to make sure that people who otherwise wouldn't come in contact with each other would come in contact with each other. And then over on the right, Sarah Ann Jewett, regional fiction writer. So novels like Deep Haven or The Country of the Pointed Firs. One we probably don't know, or not all that many know, is this wonderful woman here. This is Laura Jean Libby. Laura Jean Libby was the immensely popular author of what was called cheap working girl fiction. And you can see an example of it over here on the right, 25 cents, yellow paper cover. This screams cheap fiction. She was also one of the best-selling authors of her day. And 3 of her novels were set at summer resorts. She sets one at Long Branch, another at Lenox, Massachusetts, and a third at Newport. And that's the one that I've reproduced here, The Flirtations of a Beauty, or A Summer Romance in Newport. Laura Jean Libby's plots were wild melodramas with a very virtuous working class heroine who eventually ends up married and wealthy at the end, but not without a lot of mischief intervening. In the case of Flirtations of a Beauty, they don't spend a whole lot of time in Newport. They too head off to the White Mountains in New Hampshire, where our heroine, and here you can see her trying to throw herself off a dock at Newport. I'm going into the bitterness of death. I'm going to set you free. Well, they get to the White Mountains, where she is kidnapped by pirates and brought down the Connecticut River. I don't even know if that's possible, but perhaps it is. And then finally, a trio of Scribner's authors. The Scribner Archives was absolutely fascinating to take a look at. And these are a trio of Scribner's 3 most famous 19th century women authors. On the left, Frances Hodgson Burnett, Mary Mapes Dodge in the middle, and Mary Virginia Terhune. I had the chance to go to the Scribner Archives at Princeton, and when you start reading the letters that were going back and forth between authors and publishers, every one of these women encouraged Charles Scribner to take a book that they had already published and to republish it in a summer paperback format. My absolute favorite is Mary Virginia Terhune. She was kind of the Martha Stewart of her day. She was a domestic advice expert, had a magazine of her own, and she had written that she got a trip to Mackinac Island. It had just opened up as a summer resort, and I think this was kind of a boondoggle sort of visit. But she came back and she wrote a summer novel, a novel set on Mackinac Island. It appeared in her magazine, but then she offered it to Charles Scribner. Would you be interested in publishing this as a summer novel? And she had a very specific motive. She was building a new house and she needed the money, and that the summer novel would bring that money in for her, or so she felt. So how did all this happen? How did summer reading become an established part of the literary marketplace? That's the question that intrigued me. I'm a book historian. It's a field that looks at the intersections of authorship, reading, and publishing. And I was returning from a conference in Halifax, Nova Scotia, stopped in the bookstore. This was a June conference, and here was this big glossy brochure, Best Summer Reads. And seeing that brochure got me thinking. So I found myself thinking about my own summer reading rituals and the ways in which the publishing industry may have shaped and sustained them. And so that was the start of a journey that led me first to the John Hay Library at Brown University, where I worked with a magazine called The Book Buyer. It was a magazine from Charles Scribner, the storied New York City publisher, chock full of advertisements for the trade, the book trade. I then moved on to 19th Century Magazine, The Atlantic, Harper's, The Century, the so-called taste-making publications, and then to newspapers, trying to recover what Jane Thompson calls the machinery of publishing and reviewing that frames and presents reading to readers. Excuse me. Then it was on to publishing archives at Harvard and Princeton and Columbia, and to a long, long list of 19th century novels set at summer resorts. So what did I find? Where did this obsession lead? I wanted to take you through 2 or 3 of my findings. First, for those of you who live in New England, you know one of the reasons already. One of the reasons that summer reading took shape has to do with the rise, it coincides with the dramatic rise of travel, tourism, and summer leisure in Victorian America and in the Gilded Age. Taking its lead from Britain and Europe, where landscape and spa tourism was well established by the 18th century, domestic tourism in the US developed in the late 1700s around places like Niagara Falls, the Hudson River, the Catskills, the White Mountains, Nahant, Mount Desert Island, all of these places. After the Civil War, the market for summer leisure expanded absolutely exponentially. Part of that was due to the new wealth of the post-Civil War period. It broadened the customer base for very lavish resort experiences. So witness the appearance of the grand resort hotels along the New England coast and into the White Mountains. The railroad system expanded, making it cheaper and easier to get different places. Most importantly, though, I think, while summer leisure kind of started as an elite practice, an elite pursuit, and it was chronicled as such in the magazines of the period also saw the birth of a new middle class, a class of small business owners, government workers, teachers, clerks, who increasingly sought summer leisure as a marker of social distinction. In the 19th century, summer leisure becomes what Stuart Blumen calls an emerging middle class way of life. I think this slide pretty much sums up the immense interest in summer leisure, the period. This is Charles Dudley Warner on the right. He is the author of many things. Their Pilgrimage is a summer novel that takes his characters to probably 15 or 20 different summer resorts in one volume. And he wrote, "When one is on the coast in July or August, it seems as if the whole 50 millions of people had come down to lie on the rocks, wade in the sand, and dip into the sea. In no other nation, probably, is there such a general summer hijera." So the demand for summer leisure then, it was significant, and the period's remarkably robust print culture definitely supported it. Newspapers had their own reporters, and 2 prominent weeklies, Harper's Weekly, which had played such a significant role in Civil War coverage, And Frank Leslie's Illustrated Weekly made summer resorts and summer leisure prominent parts of the period's visual culture. Let me give you some examples here that I think are quite glorious. The first here, really sharp contrast, I think, with his Civil War illustrations. Winslow's Homer's resort illustrations are just the epitome of fashionability and femininity. Over the top left here, this is young women in the stands at the Saratoga racetrack, kind of urging on the horses below. Well, maybe not. I think they're kind of checking out each other for what fashions they're wearing, what size of the sleeve, how long the feather is in the hat. I think they're engaged in that. And then down on the right, braving the winds on the bluff at Long Branch. So really establishing a visual culture around travel and tourism. And then this image, this image is from Frank Leslie's. Very, very frequently, Leslie featured summer life, especially at Saratoga Springs. And this is an illustration for color of a hop, a dance that showcased the new ballroom at the celebrated Grand Union Hotel. So this rise of travel and tourism is just hugely important. And that brings me kind of to my second finding. And that is that while you have all these people interested in summer travel and tourism, and that probably should have been an advantage, capitalizing on summer leisure wasn't going to be an easy task. The summer novel, the light summer reading, it just wasn't a given, no matter how many people may have been heading to the mountains or the seaside. In the 1870s, by the 1870s, for example, booksellers in the book press had routinely acknowledged that book sales absolutely slowed during the summer season as vacationers went out and sought different leisure time activities. A number of the descriptions of the resorts at the time talk about them as being like a fishbowl existence. It's a place where you went to see and be seen. It was not the place you went to curl up in the corner with a good book. In 1877, Publishers Weekly, the industry's major trade publication, even came out and warned booksellers that summer was, quote, usually a dull time, and that they needed to do more to push light reading. I think more worrisome, though, for any publisher that was interested in jumpstarting a summer season was the cultural conversation that existed at the time around light reading. In 1876, the Reverend T. DeWitt Talmage, Talmage was a prominent Brooklyn preacher with a very, very large congregation. He launched the summer season that year with a sermon that was reprinted in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. And this sermon absolutely condemned summer life at Saratoga Springs. Life in general, the gossip, the dancing, the horse racing, all the frivolities he condemned. But he leveled some of his severest criticism against summer reading itself. In fact, he called summer reading, and I love this term, literary poison in August. And he warned his congregation that the kinds of light novels read in the summer were absolutely dangers to their remodeled souls. So here's the Reverend Talmage over here on the left. And here are two quotes from this sermon. The sermon was reprinted again about three years later, word for word. He recycled it. And he recycled it while he was at Saratoga enjoying summer. Quote, do not let the frogs and the lice of a corrupt printing press jump and crawl into your Saratoga trunk or White Mountain valise. Would it not be an awful thing for you if you had your hand in one of those paper-covered romances, the hero, a Parisian roue, the heroine, an unprincipled flirt, chapters in the book that you would not read to your children at the rate of $100 a line? And then my absolute favorite quote, I really believe there is more pestiferous trash read among the intelligent classes in July and August than in all the other 10 months of the year. Nor was Talmage alone. Throughout the 19th century, the criticism of the novel in general and cheap paperback fiction in particular was absolutely rampant. 19th century clerics and cultural critics invariably equated novel reading with physical and moral debasement. And invariably, they identified women as the ones who would most likely suffer. Women were most at risk. Reading sensational fiction would leave them emotionally stimulated. It would increase their predisposition to hysteria. It would just generally take its toll on a woman's health and well-being. So here's some of the cheap fiction of the period. Something from Beadle and Company on the left, Laura Jean Libby in the middle, once again, A Master Workman's Oath, and then a Lovell's Library. So all of these, a wave of cheap fiction. So given these cultural cross currents, excuse me, allergy season. Given these cultural cross currents, the period between 1870 and 1900, the period that we're looking at tonight, it really wasn't the most congenial setting for the birth of summer reading, but publishers persisted. And honestly, they pretty much were in a position where they had to. They were operating in a world of pirate publishers and cheap paperbacks that would absolutely disrupt the mainstream industry, undercutting their prices. They were in a publishing world where there was new interest in niche markets, where there was an increased emphasis on publicity and marketing. And publishers' tactics for promoting summer reading, summer fiction especially, they're worth noting. So let me mention a couple of them here. For one thing, and I think this is familiar for anybody who's been in a Barnes & Noble or any bookstore in May or June, they'd put the label, the best summer reads, on a variety of reading. Steady sellers, new novels by prominent authors, whatever they had on hand, their advertisements would slap summer reading on it. We see that today. Mainstream publishers also began packaging books as part of summer series, books by different authors, published regularly and with a distinctive cover or binding. And you can see an example of two of the most prominent summer series. Appleton had its Town and Country Library, Cassell's had a Sunshine series, and Henry Holt over here on the right with Thomas Hardy's Two on a Tower, what it called its Leisure Hour series. There was a Satchel series, a Saunterers series, and in the case of one newspaper, something called the 100 Degree in the Shade Summer Fiction series. Over here on the left, you can see this was George Monroe, one of the most prolific of the cheap paperback publishers. And basically what he did here was he pirated Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll and published it during the summer under the rubric of the Seaside Library. And you can see from the illustration, it's got a seaside scene here, complete with sailboats and lighthouses. Part of the marketing too, publishers also embraced the paperback as the perfect summer packaging. And this is significant because paperbacks in this period were known for being sinful and being scandalous. The yellow-covered French novels, paper-covered novels, were just the epitome of sinfulness. So to embrace this format was a major move on the part of publishers, but they quickly repositioned things. This is from the American Bookmaker, and I love this quote, "Paperbacks have a cool and summery look, and from their flexibility may be readily stowed away in one's pocket or thrust into an unfilled corner of a traveling bag. They adapt themselves to every conceivable reading attitude, from bolt upright to the recumbent position assumed on a sofa or lounge, or in a steamer chair, hammock, or bed, or stretched out on a greenswood or sandy beach." So they're repositioning all that might otherwise be sinful. I think perhaps most important, publishers work to reframe and repackage light summer reading, not simply as an acceptable paperback, but as a genteel act, as a welcome escape, and as an absolutely essential middle-class pleasure. Oops, I might have gotten ahead of myself here. Okay, the tastemaking monthlies, and I've given 3 covers here. So the Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, and the Century Illustrated. The tastemaking monthlies, these were arbiters of good taste and breeding, and they really helped with this repositioning. In their pages, the reviews and stories about summer reading, summer novels were described as a way to fill up the vacant hours at a resort, a way to protect against the boredom of rainy days. Not demanding too much attention, summer novels were excellent company if you were on a long ride in a Pullman car. Typically, they were episodic in structure, and that meant that the best summer novels could be taken up and put down when something else more interesting came along, as it was wont to do in a summer resort. Light, easy to read, these were also escapes from the pressures of 19th century life. I came across a review in the Overland Monthly. It's a San Francisco magazine, and they were doing a review of that year's summer reading. And the critic, who there was not a byline, but the critic who was reviewing it basically said it was an incredibly light selection of reading that year. But he went on to say that he thought one of the reasons it was so light was that there was a really severe cholera epidemic. And the way that people would escape the pressures of that was to indulge in summer reading. I think most important, publishers, authors, and the literary press together work to refame summer reading as a gracious feminine pastime. Henry James kind of gets in at the beginning of this. Henry James, in his travel writing, his 1870 travel pieces for The Nation. In one dispatch written at Saratoga Springs, James observed that there are, quote, few prettier sights than a charmingly dressed woman gracefully established in some shady spot with a piece of needlework or a book. Or this, he is on a steamer crossing Lake George to Burlington, Vermont, and he reports at length. He talks about the romantic scenery, but then he zeroes in on a group of young women who are on the steamer with him. And as he says in this quote, the scenery about the lake as a whole is such a vast, simple, undisturbed wilderness that you are almost startled to behold these little makeshifts of civilization. You half wonder at our capital little steamer and at the young ladies from the hotel on the deck with copies of Lothair on their hands. That's Benjamin Disraeli's novel. And it was pretty much the it book of the 1870 summer season. The visual culture of the period plays a role here as well, celebrating the woman as reader and in effect creating this market. This is an advertisement from the book by the Charles Scribner publication that I mentioned. Over on the left is the cover. This is the cover of the June 1888 summer number. Book publishers, Charles Scribner being one of them, Publishers Weekly, another trade publication, they would always do like a Christmas issue, and it would be all the books that would be suitable for Christmas buying. This was Scribner's attempt to kind of get a summer market going. And it devoted this entire issue to summer reading. And we can see, we've gone from the sinful and the sensational to the young woman dressed in white muslin under the boughs of an apple tree reading a book. And so the imagery has changed so very, very dramatically, constructing this market. Over on the right, copy light books for summer reading. And if you notice what is offered, we've got a brilliant new novel, a clever book of modern society, a fourth edition of a popular book, and then others at the bottom are kind of old standbys. And that kind of mix, something new, something social, something from our backlist. That was a really common strategy. Some other images, Winslow Homer, the novel reader, or on the bottom here, Homer, the hammock read. I love both of these. On the left, the Isle of Shoals, Sunlight on the Isle of Shoals by Frederick Child Hassam. The Isle of Shoals, Celia Thaxter's family has a hotel there, and artists and literary men would have gone there. It's off the New Hampshire coast. And then the summer porch on the right. William Merritt Chase's, it's just called Idle Hours, his wife and children on the hills overlooking a beach on Long Island at Shinnecock. And again, the white muslin, the beautiful umbrella, the books, the pillows, just creating this sense of idleness. And then finally, in terms of the visual culture, by the 1890s, that kind of was the golden age of poster illustration, and US publishers adopted this as a convention from French publishers. So these would be the posters that would be out in the stationery stores, in the kiosks, places where you would buy the magazine, in the train station. And these would be the posters advertising the summer editions. So at the top here, the Century Magazine's Midsummer holiday number. The ones at the bottom, Lippincott's August edition, Harper's June, and then on the right, Scribner's for August, the midsummer fiction number. So on all of these, using the female body, the female reader, as a way to make this acceptable. Indeed, I think one of the key characteristics of what I call the American summer novel, the novel set specifically at a summer resort, one of the key characteristics is the female protagonist. She's going to be young, she's going to be intelligent, though she's not necessarily in search of a husband, she's going to find one by the novel's end. And I think a really good example of that, and again, we get this continuation of femininity and a feminine practice. It's this wonderful novel by Blanche Willis Howard called One Summer. Over on the left, this isn't the first edition. This is a later one that was illustrated almost as a gift book, a summer gift book by Augustus Hoppin. And then over on the right, you can see the title page, Sunshine's Everywhere and Summer Too. It's 1885, so it's a long way back. It was first published in 1875, so it had been out for about a decade at that point. And it's in its 38th edition. So first published in 1875, it's set in a summer community along the Maine coast. This phenomenally popular novel, it tells the story of a summer courtship between the spirited, independent Lorelei Doane, over here on the left, and the patient and very much put upon Philip Ogden, the young man that Laura very coldly receives after an embarrassing misunderstanding when they first meet. Whenever the two meet, and it's a small community on the Maine seashore, so they do meet quite a lot, Ogden tries to make amends for his blunder, and Laura coolly rebuffs him. At the story's end, though, the two meet again in Bar Harbor, where Laura at last admits her love for him, and the two become engaged. Amiable, spirited, Howard's novel met with both immediate success and long-standing favor. First published by James Osgood, the prominent Boston publisher, the novel was part of the firm's Saunterer series for summer reading. And Osgood advertised it very specifically for the summer market. The advertisements for this novel say the novel was likely to be a favorite at the seaside and the mountains. And a favorite it was. The novel went into its third edition by July of the first year, and it appeared in successive reprintings nearly every year from 1875 till 1900. This is an absolutely remarkable run, and not at all typical for the summer novels that appeared in this period, many of which were, quite frankly, as ephemeral as the season that they celebrated. Book plates at the library, book plates and library records of the period suggest that the appeal crossed social lines. Patron records, for example, from the Muncie, Indiana Public Library indicate that a copy of One Summer was highly popular among blue-collar and lower white-collar female readers. But it also seems to have circulated among more elite class. I found copies of One Summer, for example, at the Stanford Library with book plates that indicated that it was a gift from the Stanford family estate itself. Another copy in the Harvard University Library was the gift of a professor emeritus at the school. To be sure, summer reading never became, I have to be honest, it never became completely acceptable. There was many a satiric look at women and summer reading throughout the century. Some of these images, I think, capture that quite nicely. This is the cover of Life magazine. We've got a young girl in a hammock. Underneath her arm, she has some candies, so she's consuming the candies just as she is consuming the book, which is called A Burglar's Love. And you can kind of guess what the plot of that might be. This one, this is in the exhibit at the Twain House. I love this one from Charles Dana Gibson. Books would have been offered to be sent to the various summer locales. Somebody could order them and they would be sent. And these are a group of Gibson girls on the beach, probably at Newport. It's called Marooned. Their books have arrived. They've ripped through them and consumed them, and now they are totally and completely spent. And then finally, this one, C.S. Reinhardt, The Shepherd and His Flock. This is a teacher's convention at Newport, and this is the Newport Hotel. And so the cleric, who would have looked quite badly at summer reading, is sitting there watching this bank of women engaging in such. Okay, finally, my third finding. Summer reading wasn't without its tensions. Is summer a time for an escape, or is it a time for education? Is it time for that lightweight novel, or should you be reading some serious tome? By the 1890s, women's reading groups were all the rage. And Louise Stockton, one of the major voices in the reading group movement, she cautioned her followers against indulging in light reading. She said, quote, "The mistake made by too many people is given this golden season to summer reading, to the idle and observed novels that year after year are precipitated on a public that reads the same vacant stuff." She advised her members of the Porch Club, as she called them, to choose the works of Homer instead. The Iliad, the Odyssey, they had so much value for so little bulk. Then, too, there was Chautauqua, and that's the slide that I have here. The summer meeting ground on the shores of Lake Chautauqua in western New York State, and one of the most dominant cultural forces in the 19th century. Light reading wasn't part of Chautauqua's plan. Several novels of the period were set at Chautauqua, and they very heavily involved. These novels were a way to promote attendance at these venues. And one of them captures that kind of serious spirit. One of the protagonists of a novel set at the Nebraska Chautauqua, she catches sight of a young woman reading a yellow paperback novel while she's waiting for a lecture to begin, and she very quickly condemns the practice. What on earth did she come here for? It would have been cheaper for her to have stayed home and do her cheap novel reading. Chautauqua promoted purposeful reading, disciplined study, a kind of working and middle-class self-culture that involved a 4-year course of study. And every year, those groups gathered. Chautauqua honored its graduates during the summer, large numbers of them women, and they would honor them on what was called Recognition Day, when they would make a procession to the Hall of Philosophy. They process through the grounds to a flurry of white handkerchiefs, which was the Chautauqua symbol, and celebrate their accomplishments. Now, I don't know what you read this summer. I don't know whether you opted for pleasure and escape or something more serious. We certainly live in serious times. I don't know whether you read paperbacks or hardcover or you broke out your Kindle. But whatever choices you made, I hope you'll see yourself as part of this long tradition of summer readers. A tradition that started more than a century and a half ago, a tradition that is culturally important and anything but frivolous, and something that we engage in every year when May rolls around. And I'll end with this photo, a thank you and questions, and then this photo, Mark Twain on the right, with his friend William Dean Howells on the left. They're at Kittery Point in Maine, which was one of William Dean Howells' absolutely favorite places, and one that is most closely associated with him in the summertime. Thank you so much, and I will stop sharing, and I think we go to questions.
All right, there we go. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. If I could come back to this earth and be reincarnated, I would love to be a book historian because it just sounds like so much fun. I absolutely love that. And it's such an interesting topic. So thank you so much for that. So we'll dive into questions. So I see one has popped up already. Did book clubs meet during the summer, or did people just read while maybe feeling guilty that they were reading something too summer-like?
Most of the book clubs did not meet during the summer. If you read the letters and journals and the minutes of the various meetings, it was very, very typical for them to meet through the entire year. And then when May and June came, because so many people were going to different places, they did not continue. So I think that's really fascinating to think about. Maybe the desire or the need to do summer reading had something to do with the guilt involved in not keeping up with that endeavor. I think that's a really interesting idea.
It is. Another question is if you have read any of the sensational books for women, and if so, do you have a favorite?
I do adore Laura Jean Libby. I just the plots are wild. They're madcap. If there's a plot complication, how do we solve it? Brain fever, and somebody goes in, suffers from brain fever for 5 months so that other things can work out. There are train crashes. I mean, magnificent, huge train crashes. People get amnesia and then surface 100 pages later. I really adore Laura Jean Libby. It may be an idiosyncratic taste on my part.
I might have to read some of that.
Yes, I highly recommend it. I highly recommend it.
To dig into that. So it seems, I don't know if you came across this in your research, that really the Northeast seems to be the hub of the summer reading becoming popularized. Do you have a sense of when it really started to spread? I mean, now it's of course all over the country, but when did that really start to take off?
That's interesting. One of the things that the readers of the manuscript said was, basically, what about the rest of the country? This seems to focus in New England. And I think because so many of the taste-making publishers were centered here, so much of the publishing industry was centered here, so many of the authors, professional authors of the period, vacationed here. That meant for a big concentration of New England settings and New England books. When you start going into the West, I think the only one that I came across on the West Coast was a very strange California novel. It took place in San Diego. And of course, that wouldn't have been a summer setting. That would have been escaping the winter and going to sunny California. I think it was also unusual because it was aimed at men. It was called Flirtation Camp. It, of course, moved on who's going to get together with whom and will they get married at the end. But every chapter was a different animal or bird that the men shot. This was the grouse chapter, and something would happen in the grouse chapter, and then they would go after another bird, and it was the most peculiar novel, and it was the only one that I could say had a definite summer or vacation setting that took place in the West. So in terms of how it moves from after that, I'd just be speculating, but I would guess in the 1920s, when the markets become more national, the marketing of summer fiction does.
That makes sense. We have someone who wants you to recommend a specific Libby book, I think.
Oh gosh. Okay. The thing is, they're hard to come by. Some of them are available Google Books, Internet Archive, that kind of thing. Flirtations of a Beauty is quite nice. Only a Mechanic's Daughter is also very good. The one that takes place in Lenox, and I'm blanking, Lindell's, oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name for that one, but I can get it and you can send it. Those are all really quite wonderful. As I say, I'm more familiar with the ones that are set at summer resorts, but absolutely, yeah. If you like K-drama and you like melodrama and wild plots, Laura Jean Libby is your author.
All right, so we'll have to check her out. Another question is, I was very surprised when I was reading your book, because I did not know this about her. It really surprised me about Louisa May Alcott and how she wrote about sexual agency during this period, So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the things that she wrote, especially geared more towards the summer reading.
Yeah, the ones that are set at summer resorts, there's one. It's a group of young people who are on the shore at some summer resort, and they've all gotten really, really bored. They've exhausted the women have exhausted their embroidery, the men are no longer smoking, and so their solution is hashish, which they indulge in rather great detail. And two of the characters don't realize that that's what they're doing, and it just unleashes this wild ride, drugged through a storm. You use the metaphor, take that metaphor for what it is, and these absolutely wild passions that seem to be kind of found in these very, very proper people otherwise. It's a very short story. You can probably find it online. I'm pretty sure you could. And the blood and thunder tales are not what one expects of Alcott, but she had a living to make. And as a woman and as a professional author, she went where the market was and did the best she could for her family. But they're also, sorry, you'll think that I dwell who knows where. But between Laura Jean Libby and the Blood and Thunder Tales of Louisa May Alcott, I think you'd have a really good read.
Oh, I can't wait. I have to dive into those too. So I have a couple more questions. One of them being, how did most people during this period, especially as the summer reading popularity is starting to take off, how did most people get access to these books? Was it mostly through those book magazines you mentioned where you'd order the books through there? I mean, I know bookstores are starting to pop about, but they're not as widely accessible as it is today. So how did most of that purchasing happen before they take off on these trips?
Yeah, in a variety of ways. You're right. There weren't very many like dedicated bookstores, especially in resort locations. So you do see some advertisements, say, for example, advertisements at Bar Harbor. I'm blanking now. If any of you are familiar with Bar Harbor, I'm blanking on the name of the bookstore that is downtown. And I believe it was still there in the period that we're talking about. And you would see advertisements, come to this store and there'll be Indian baskets and there'll be the most popular paperback novels. So some resort areas. I came across a reference and I wasn't able to track it down, so I didn't include it in the book, that in one of the New Jersey beaches had a vending machine that dispensed summer novels. You could buy them in a vending machine. You could also send for them. Most of the publishers would say, yes, Sherman's bookstore. Most of the publishers would say, you can order from us and we'll send it wherever. Some libraries, the Boston Athenaeum would send out its books. When people requested them, it would send them out to their members' summer homes. So they were able to get books that way as well. Many of these would have been available. Train station kiosks would have been a big place for these. And some resorts had libraries, circulating libraries. Saratoga Springs had one. And so I think that's an exception rather than the rule. In Maine, if any of you are familiar with Poland Springs had its own library. It was the State of Maine building that had been part of the White City in Chicago in the World's Fair in the 1890s. And they brought it back, granite block by granite block, and reassembled it at Poland Springs and turned a good part of it into a library. And it was the library was kind of catch as catch can. People would kind of offload their books at the end of the summer. They're returning home, well, let's donate it to the library. So it was this very strange collection of books that they ended up with. But people could go and they could borrow and they could keep it for a week. And there was a certain number that they could. So there were a variety of ways that people could get books, but certainly not as easy as it is for us today.
Oh, that's really surprising. I love that the libraries would send it to summer homes.
Yes.
That's fascinating. I never knew that. Good for them. And this kind of, we touch upon it a little bit with Twain, is that there are so many ways to sell books back then. He loved to do subscription publishing. So that would be a door-to-door salesman trying to pitch you the book and then getting you to order a copy. So his wouldn't have been as available necessarily as some of these other authors that you're talking about that would have had more access, so to speak. I know we're running out of time, so if anyone has any last minute questions, please add them to the Q&A. But what I would like to ask is, throughout your research, especially with being a book historian, what did you find the most surprising or the most interesting about the topic of summer reading?
I loved going through, I don't know, maybe it's the voyeur in me. I loved going through journals and letters and getting people's reports of what they read and what they were doing. And I think what surprised me was not so much what they were reading. There was this real kind of social connection there as well. But take Bar Harbor, for example. I love to get up there for a couple of days. It renews my soul. And people back in the 1890s were doing the same things that I was doing when I went to Bar Harbor. We're walking the path along the water. We're going out to the island. We're making sure that the waves aren't going to come in, where the tide isn't going to come in. And so just the continuity between the practices back then and the practices now. I think that was what really surprised me versus anything necessarily in the books. I must admit, maybe one thing surprised me. As an undergraduate, I vowed that I would never read William Dean Howells again. As an undergraduate, I had to read The Hazard of New Fortune. I was incredibly bored by it. And for most of my project, I just said, I am not dealing with William Dean Howells. And of course, he's got an entire chapter, and I had a great deal of fun. So, Mr. Howells, I'm sorry.
We love that. We love that. Well, I want to thank you so much, Donna. This was fascinating. And I have to say, I'm a huge reader, as I'm sure most of you in the audience are. And I have always wondered, when you see, like you mentioned at the beginning, summer reading and everyone starts coming out with their lists of summer reads and beach reads. I never really thought about it until I read your book and started this exhibit, the history behind it. So your book is absolutely fascinating as far as really learning the history of how this became popularized and some of those interesting stories like Louisa May Alcott and the sexual agency and all these fun summer resort settings and tourism. And so I highly encourage all of you. I know Jody put the link to Donna's book in the chat. I highly encourage you, especially if you're a reader or you love literature, to buy Donna's book because it is just absolutely fascinating. So I want to thank you, Donna, again for both tonight and your wonderful lecture, and also for the inspiration and information that you provided us for our exhibition. And hopefully we'll get you down soon and you'll get to see it in person, and we'll chat more in the future. But thank you again for everything. It was great.
Thank you. And buy Laura Jean Libby. There's my advice.
Everyone. That's your thing. Everyone has to go and read Libby, so we can have a discussion about it.
Great.
So thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, Donna. Good night, everyone.